Thanks everyone for coming. This panel is on the public-private partnership in surveillance, myth or reality. And I'm David Robinson, and I'll be moderating. We have a diverse and distinguished group of people up here on the stage, and I will let each of them introduce themselves and speak to the issue at hand. But let me just sort of give you a map of the territory. To my right, I was going to say to my far right, but it's probably not politically descriptive. But on the end here is Josh Mendelson, who is at Engine, which is a group that provides policy advocacy to early-stage startups that are often based out here in the Bay Area. Beside him is Jimmy Schultz, who is an internet entrepreneur with 20 years experience in the tech field in Germany, and is also a former German parliamentarian, so has both hands-on technical and also first-hand policy experience with the tech and privacy issue as it arises in Europe. I'm David Robinson. I work with a small team of computer scientists in Washington providing technical advice to nonprofits and governments called Robinson and You. And I'm thrilled to be here today. Marie Georges is an independent expert on privacy and policy issues who among other roles, is an advisor to the Council of Europe on privacy matters. Regan MacDonald does privacy and other policy work for Access based in Europe, and really deserves the full credit for pulling together this amazing group of folks. And Brad Burnham, Union Square Ventures in New York, a distinguished and experienced investor of startups, but also someone who has really made a mark on the policy scene. Speaking as a Washingtonian who works on tech policy issues, I can tell you that really in the SOPA fight that so many of us were engaged in, Brad really played a key role in bringing entrepreneurs' voices to the table in that discussion, and I think it's a role that we're all glad to have seen grow onto other policy issues as well. And with that, I will ask each of our panelists to give a few minutes, or let me just say just one or two words myself substantively about what we're about to talk about, and then I'll hand it over to Josh and we can work down the line. The question, as the panel is titled, is myth or reality, and I think we've learned in the last 9 months since the Snowden leaks that it's both a reality of a partnership and also a reality of sometimes a non-partnership between the private sector and the public sector on surveillance. So we definitely learned about cases where people are being paid by the government secretly to convey various kinds of information, and some of them may even be being overpaid, as we recently learned in the case of Sprint, which is now being sued for having overcharged the US government for its surveillance needs. But at the same time, so in the case, for example, of Google, we've seen both that there is secret request traffic going on that the Snowden leaks unearthed, but there's also raw hacking, if you will, of infrastructure. So not only was Google answering secret requests subject to legal compulsion in the US and elsewhere, but at the same time, unbeknownst to them, the links between their data centers were being tapped. And so one of the things that we've learned is that not only do individual citizens not understand necessarily what is going on or are not in a position to know what's going on. But even the companies themselves have some more knowledge than the public has regarding their role in government surveillance, but knowledge that is, in all likelihood, materially incomplete. And I think that the policy question that I'm hoping we'll be able to get at today is, as activists, citizens, people who care about privacy, what can or should we reasonably expect to do about this? What is the role of the private sector vis-a-vis the public sector that we ought to hope for or aim toward? And with sort of that as a framing question, I'll turn it over to Josh to start us off.
Cool, thank you, David. Well, you sort of alluded at the end to where I'm going to go with just a handful of opening remarks. One disclaimer or disclosure I should throw out at the beginning is I actually started my career working at the Department of Defense, and so I felt for a long time like I was sort of on the other side of this debate, and in truth, that's not really the case at all. In fact, what we've found for anyone who's been in any sort of security, particularly cybersecurity, sort of circular universe, we sort of always assumed that either the US government or some other government was out there obtaining information that they wanted. What's been so shocking in these disclosures has been the sheer scope and the breadth of the information that's being sucked up, and the lack of discrimination in how that information is obtained and utilized. So certainly it's great now to see more people having this discussion and being part of this debate. Small anecdote, I remember my now wife, I met her and I learned that she worked at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And I was like, oh, this is awesome. She's finally going to know what keeps me up at night. And recognizing like these are big issues that really only the folks at like EFF and a handful of other places cared. So not the case. And that's really exciting to see, and it's nice to see all of you here. What I will say, however, is that there's a natural tendency, at least in journalism writ large right now, to assume that companies were absolutely complicit in what was going on and had far more understanding than one would like to convey. And I really think that that's not the case. Certainly there are the telecos who I put in a different category in a lot of ways, and certainly now that Sprint is making quite a bit of money off of their engagement with the government. But when we're talking about tech companies, when we talk about the Googles and the Facebooks and others like Dropbox, who are a bit smaller, young startups, this wasn't a line of business that they were in. And I think that every executive and every developer you meet there is somebody who, if they weren't doing the job they're doing now, would be in this room and would be listening to this panel, would be engaging on this issue. And we're all really aligned ideologically. And so with that, really, I would say that we need to be focused on where do we go from here, what's changed and what needs to evolve. And my argument is it's all the more reason why, as a developer of a product, as the user of a particular offering, it's incumbent on both of us in that equation to make sure we're doing our best to safeguard the information that we don't want to have shared. And we can't really have faith in our government. We certainly shouldn't have faith in governments that may want to obtain our information for any malicious purpose. But there are plenty of other actors who we know, bad actors who we know, can just as easily exploit important information to you. I mean, I'm thinking of data breaches. We don't talk about that as much when we're talking about security and surveillance, but I think in a lot of ways the problems, right, the technical problems, the root problems are the same. So consequently, my perspective is very much one of this should be a really good wake-up call for all of us that love to build products quickly, deploy them quickly, utilize them quickly. All the more reason why we need to get really good at understanding how we secure that information, protect that information, and secure and protect our users.
Thanks. Jim?
Well, we all lost trust, I think, into the governments and to companies who are dealing with our data. I started off developing a software around 15 years ago we called Big Brother, and it was able to do exactly what the name implies. And Germany at that time was talking about, we were an ISP, Internet Service Provider too, was talking about in Germany the government about having a law that would force me to have a black box in my server room, in my holy server room, which will spy on me and my customers. And at that time, I understood what we have developed with Big Brother was, well, not just only a tool for billing and charging internet services, but it was also a weapon. And then I joined an expert group of the German government and fighting it for 2 years against that law. It didn't succeed, so I decided to switch the side of the table, became a parliamentarian, which took me another 9 years. Now, we, after the Snowden revelation, everyone, I think, understands that our privacy is in great danger. And what do we do? What can we do against it? Who of you in the room is using WhatsApp? Well, if you ask in a school class of 7th grade, almost 100% of the young kids will use WhatsApp. All their communication is done by WhatsApp. I asked in my party, and the parliamentarians, 93 of our parliamentarians in my party who's using WhatsApp, and about 60 were using WhatsApp for internal communication. That's ridiculous, because we know what we are spied on. We're parliamentarians, we're talking about secret things. I told them, don't do it, you are going to be spied on. And they didn't believe it. It was over a year ago. Now, I think everyone understands how dangerous using tools like that can be. And I have a lot of people you can, and it's quite easy to encrypt your data, to save your data. And it's your responsibility to do so. Because you lock your car when you leave it. Of course you lock your car. Because there are laws against to steal a car, but of course you lock it just to be sure that it's not stolen or robbed. And the same thing, you have to lock your data and secure your data, and it's quite easy. There are tools, there are subsidiaries for WhatsApp which are encrypted, very, very good, and they are secret. And these companies can't be forced to give their data away because the data is so encrypted that they even can't read the data themselves. Not secured data. The companies can be forced to give it to the governments. For example, using Gmail, using webmail, using any mail client, mail which is not encrypted, the mail provider can be forced to give away your data. Using unsecured chat software, using unsecured phone software, all these brings the private sector, the companies, into the situation that they have to give their data away on laws there are for illegal interception. But if you secure your data yourself, they can't be forced to do so.
That's brilliant.
I will be talking also as a practitioner. I have been 30 years in the Data Protection Authority in France and 4 years at the European level for writing the Directive of '95. It's difficult for users, people say users, to understand what's going on. But I think that the more computerization is going in the daily life of people, more and more. Before it was only inside the enterprises, inside the state. Now it's more and more in our lives. People can more and more understand. For years and years, since '81, in Europe we translated the American principles on data protection, which never came out as being binding. We did it in Europe, the same principles. The same for private and public sector. When you collect data, it must be fair and transparent for specific purposes, and you don't collect more data than necessary, and you don't keep them more than necessary for the purpose. Plus security, that is the principles that you invented in America, miraculously, in the 70s. We still wait. When we heard 2 years ago, Obama saying that he would put on the table this consumer privacy bill of rights, Oh, we said, oh, okay, I won't die without having seen that in the United States. Well, today I'm afraid that we don't talk any longer. And this is a real problem, because I can assure you, I've been making cooperation all over the world, in all countries. South Korea, in Africa, in at least 5 countries, in Latin America. Those principles, these principles which are preventive from abuse, both in the public and the private sector. They are shared every day. When you talk with people, they completely agree. There are no differences. In the world, the area in which there is a huge differences between people is the freedom of speech, the length of it, the limits. But under these data protection principles, they are the same. But as IT are evaluating, there is a need to adapt. And what did Europe? They took this idea of the independent agency that they are in the United States. I learned recently that the first state in the world where there was this kind of mechanism to make things going was in Sweden in the 17th century. It's a small country, it's amazing. And we did that because we have those data protection authorities, and people say, to adapt, to show how those principles can be worked with the developing of data of Now, about surveillance, I have to say that for a long time I've known some points of it from the United States. The first time was when I had to deal with the question of PNR, the passenger name record that US was asking from everybody going to the United States, the reservation data. And when I saw that, I am an economist basically, when I saw the data the Americans and administration wanted to get, there was this, the amount of the ticket. What is this problem? What is the link between the price of a flight ticket and terrorism? Tell me.
Maria, I'm sorry, but...
Okay, I can always stop. You know, you understood what I meant. So, well, what I think, to be short, it's really time, and so many people are saying that to the United States. It's the interest of private sector, individuals, and government also, to be sure that they do what they have to do and no more, to get those principles adopted. And I have to tell you that because of some NGOs, American NGOs, your government came 2 years ago as observer at the Council of Europe, the committee of this convention I was talking about. And now everybody is asking that your state has to come to that convention. It has a world portée mondiale. It is open to third countries. It is not at all political. It is not. It's only human rights. It's not, as I told you, only principles seen by Europeans. In Europe, we protect people, no matter their nationality, with regard to a data protection.
And we should return to this because that's the difference between the...
Ah, that's terrible. You can't believe it. How can you continue with IT services all over the world and saying, we protect Americans and not the non-Americans? Are you kidding? You have to stop that. Okay? Now, we will discuss about mass surveillance afterwards. Oh, okay, thank you.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you.
I'm glad that you're so passionate about this. It's nice to have more passion. And I think we should be more angry about these revelations and about not having the security of having our privacy protected. And I think one of the points that Mehdi really touches on from the EU perspective is this difference between the collection bit, which usually relates to the corporate sector, and the use. How can that data be used? And this was really kind of the foundation for this panel and for this debate that's been happening, which really discusses and gets to the core of, if we're looking at privacy, if we conceive of privacy as an international human right, a fundamental right in a lot of regions, and we perceive it as what it's supposed to be, which is basically control. Control over your personal information and control over your identity. Then it's important to take a big picture or holistic approach and to look at all of the factors that are involved that do lead to privacy risks. And so in this sense, I think in today's day and age and after the revelations, it's become absolutely clear that whatever corporations know or whatever is online or collected in an electronic format is known and can be knowable by third parties. And that certainly includes intelligence services. So from my perspective, as a privacy advocate, I see the two as very intimately related. But that doesn't mean to say, as Josh brought up, it's not about necessarily attacking companies and talking about the privacy, whether or not they're working with them or to what extent and to what legal basis this was based on. But what we know from the revelations is that whether or not they were aware, whether or not they were complicit, there was access happening. So a lot, from a reform perspective, I think it's important to look at both the collection side. So on the one hand, those that are collecting and processing data should do their best, and not do their best, but should and must, close those backdoors and secure the data that they have. But then to take it one step further, we should be rethinking different models and think about the collection of data. We need to be collecting so much data. And I just want to throw out a few things for discussion. And the first is, I guess, the most blunt regulatory way to do this, like what's happening in the EU, is to pass a binding regulation and to regulate corporate collection, to collect less data, to implement things like privacy by design, or implement very hefty fines if there are any breaches in the privacy regulations. But at the same time, if we're realistic, and I would really like to be proven wrong about this, but it doesn't seem like it's in the cards for the US to join basically the rest of the world and to implement kind of comprehensive regulation that would regulate company collection. But the tech sector is all about innovation. So if privacy is going to be protected and respected, if it is, as we are seeing now with the revelations, becoming of consumer interest and therefore good for the bottom line, then what are some different approaches that we can do? On the one hand, the law that is going to pass in the EU will have quite hefty fines for companies who are in breach of law. So economies of scale would say that companies from the United States operating outside the rest of the world would have to comply with other data protection regimes. So would they change their policies just for the EU and the others and not for the US? Or would this be a market interest or an economy's interest to get them to adopt their own policies without regulation? And then the other question is, are there other business models that we could be exploring? Do we have to rely on big data and the monetization of data for the way that we use internet services? Now that it's becoming, if consumers were given the option, for example, to pay for their security, maybe they would. People are buying songs on iTunes all the time, when in the beginning of the internet, well, we're still struggling with this, people thought that no one would pay for music because now we have the internet and everyone wants to pirate it. But we know that people do pay for music as long as it's available and they have the right services to do so. So maybe they would also pay for security. And then the other question, if we are still operating in an age of big data, when data is the currency of the modern age, we should actually be conscious of the currency that we're carrying and the currency that we're giving away. Because at the moment, most consumers, most users of these services feel that they're using these services for free. And in fact, they're not free. We are trading it. And we are not really conscious of the fact that we're trading this. And this is what, again, comes down to the control and to the power point of privacy. It's not about not liking a company's policies, therefore you don't use it. If people are aware of what they're doing and what they're actually giving away, and they're actually informed of the risks, then they can make an exchange. And the situation would be much better from the user perspective.
I want to bookmark that to come back to, but I want to let Brad
There's lots here to come back to. So, you know, I'm going to take a slightly different tack. I'm going to start by saying I don't think this discussion is really about privacy. I think it's about trust. Because I think that there is enormous value that we get when we can trust some entity with our data. We can get forms filled in automatically. We can get search queries that are more relevant. We can get, I work with a company that does language learning, and they watch every single click that a user does, and in the process they're able to group them into different learning styles and adapt the program for the learning style and improve the experience dramatically for the user. But boy, that is invasive. I mean, they're watching every single click, right? So I believe in collective intelligence. I believe in the opportunity that the internet has created to create this sort of superorganism of humanity that involves collective intelligence. So I worry a little bit that when we focus too much on the notion of privacy, we'll drop into these protective shells, insulated by crypto and sort of isolated from the rest of the world, isolated from the opportunity to create value in this data. But that said, we have a huge problem because there is really no one that you can trust out there right now. There is no structure within which you can trust anyone. So would you rather trust a government or a company? One of the problems with trusting a government is, Marie points out, is the U.S. doesn't have a relationship with anybody other than a U.S. citizen, and for some reason thinks that they're not obliged to respect the rights of anybody other than a U.S. citizen. That's ridiculous. Google actually does. They don't make a distinction between a U.S. citizen and any other citizen. For if you're a Google customer, you're a Google customer. And obviously Google has a financial incentive to serve those customers equally and to respect them equally. And so it's kind of tricky to decide who to trust in that situation. It gets trickier when you realize that even if Google thinks they're respecting the data, they're being hacked by governments and not protecting the data. So I think that there is a problem with trusting a corporation. A corporation is really financially driven. They're going to try and maximize the returns for their shareholders. I think I could argue that many internet services actually favor, if they think about all the stakeholders between users and partners and shareholders, they favor shareholders more than they should, because a lot of these consumer-facing web services are actually created by users, and all the value is contributed by users. That's one of the points that Reagan makes, that the data is a currency that you contribute to create that value, and I think that most corporations don't fully respect that. So I think it's a challenge to trust them, but I think it's an equally big challenge to trust a government. I think that the approach that the EU is taking is a little scary to me, because I worry that the results of actually very well-intentioned regulation that's designed to protect the interest of users will have the perverse consequence of actually entrenching the existing companies that have the resources to manage that regulation, and it will cut off the innovation that's created all sorts of interesting new companies. So our challenge is to come up with a market structure that creates the proper incentives. But by the way, it's not just a market structure, because if anybody, one of my favorite things on this whole topic is a series of lectures by Evan Moglin from Columbia, if anybody's seen those. He makes a point which I think is really important, and that is that this is not a transaction between me and Google. I give you data, you give me mail, because it actually has an environmental consequence that ropes in anybody else that I email with. So I may agree for that trade. I'll give you the data, you can read my mail, but they're also reading your mail if you're mailing me, and you never agreed to that trade. So we can't just allow the market to solve the problem. There's a sort of an externality like pollution that we have to manage with some kind of social construct. So that's just a whole bunch of thoughts about, what works and what doesn't in this case.
This is an amazing conversation. It's a huge conversation, and I'm going to try to focus us in on a couple pieces of it with the foreknowledge that it's going to be unsatisfying and that there are other pieces that we won't explore. But one thing that I heard in a lot of what people said that I really would like to come back to is this distinction between users and customers. So most Google users are not Google customers in the sense that they are not revenue sources for Google. They don't give money to Google. For the most part, they receive services in which the advertising revenue covers the cost of the service. Obviously some people, you can buy storage or you can buy apps for your domain and have a more, privacy protected setup potentially. Or you can, of course, you can go to a PO box or someone else who will be in the business of, their business model is they get revenue from you and use it to provide the service that you're using, which is sort of old school these days. And I guess what I want to ask, especially for folks here who've got the entrepreneurial perspective, is, in the last 9 months, as we've started to learn more about how even the world's leading experts in protecting data from attack, who work at places like the security teams at places like Google, are not actually able to protect data from various kinds of attacks. So I guess there's really two parts to the question. One is sort of, have we started to see people want to incentivize the companies that they work with or the companies that they trust to have different incentives? Do you think that stands to make a difference? Maybe we can start, Josh, with that.
Yeah, there are a couple of I have a couple of thoughts embedded in sort of the universe of what you've said. Let me start by saying that it is important to note when we're using an example like the NSA and interfacing between the data centers of Google and other companies that was one very good security team up against another very good security team. And so I want to characterize that as a different sort of challenge to deal with, and where I think consumers tend to be far more vulnerable, which are data breaches and other very targeted attacks. One of the points that I can't miss making is just the simple fact that we live in a world where your data, one of you mentioned data as currency. Like, that's actually true, and I'm failing to remember who did this study, but there were a set of leading economists at the University of Colorado, and the study was in an obscure journal, economics journal. I feel so bad that I can't reference them or remember their names, but somebody will Google it. And so these guys, it was 3 men, and they went out and did a series of analyses, very good methodology, and found that consumers readily give up their information when they believe they're getting a valuable service in exchange for it. And being this was an economics paper, they went so far as to actually ascribe a certain dollar value to each piece of information. But what they unequivocally found was that no matter what you do, if you are providing a useful service of some sort, people will happily turn over their information with full knowledge that they're turning over their information and full knowledge that that information might be more vulnerable. So understanding user behavior, we then find ourselves in a realm of sort of saying, okay, well, what can we do best to secure that information? And weirdly, I tend not to really come up with the divide between who's a customer, like, are you paying the company versus are you simply a user and you're being monetized on top of that? I mean, at the end of the day, I think most of these companies will take everyone as a customer. You know, like I would think that a Google user, maybe you're getting Gmail for free, but frankly, like you're still very much a customer. And I think Google would say that. So skipping that divide, it really becomes, well, what can we do as innovators to really help make sure we're building the right constructs to protect those users writ large? And you know, there have been a number of approaches that I think of as market-driven, where you've got companies like SpiderOak that have popped up, and SpiderOak's truly innovative. Creation is not shared storage, and there are plenty of shared storage offerings out there. It's that they do browser-based front-end encryption of the storage, so they never have your key, there's no way to decrypt it, they're encrypting it right off the bat. That's a great way to sort of have our cake and eat it too. But of course it requires that there be more innovation in that realm. We need more SpiderOaks. We need not only the established companies to innovate to protect their users better, but we need more companies to pop up and find themselves willing to tackle this problem. How do we do better user security? How do we create better encryption algorithms? How do we create lightweight implementation methods for the systems that already exist? Go check them out at the demos. Like, you can get Tor demoed to you right now, but I promise you from experience, Tor is a pain in the ass to get going. That needs to change.
Yeah.
Does that help?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, I think one of the things for people who tried SpiderOak that's sort of lurking, that's sort of unacknowledged in a lot of these conversations, is that like SpiderOak isn't as much of a pain to use as Tor, but it's a lot more of a pain to use than Dropbox. And right, there are reasons. There are actually deep architectural reasons why that's inevitable, like the fact that if the service provider, and this goes back to something Brad said about like shells of encryption that enclose each user, if the service provider doesn't have the key to your data, then it follows, as an entailment of them not really having the key, that they can't do server-side search of your data for you, which is a nice thing that Dropbox does for people. And I think, you know, and there are actually sort of in the computer science world, innovators working on things like search over encrypted data without decrypting the data. I mean, the big stuff that's years away, right, from being a consumer product. If indeed, years later when it's developed, it ever becomes a widely used consumer product. Certainly, that's not possible within the next couple of years.
It needs to be a feature, not a product, I guess, right? Like we need it built into the core. I guess is what I would say.
Please, I would like to intervene. We cannot speak banalization, you say, French, that monetarization of the personal data. This is terrible. We cannot relate in a world where personal data are monetized. Personal data are our identity. And as you said, we need trust. And how to have trust is to be sure that you won't do anything else than which is legitimate to do. Huh? You see what I mean? Huh? We cannot leave people saying just like this with money. That personal data are money.
But we do like.
Either we as a user or customer, of course we will be all of us customers. I completely agree with the change in the economic model.
I would agree, but maybe formulate a little bit different. The contract we do with those large companies is not fair because we know what we get, but we don't know what we pay. We don't. I'm on the contrary side than you are. I believe that almost no one understands which data we will give to them and what is being done with these data. No one ever read the privacy contract of Facebook. It's 60 pages long. It's small. And if you ask, well, my children, 12 years, 13 years, 14 years old, of course they have never read it. And they have never read the WhatsApp contract, which says, and that's what they do, they send your whole address book of your smartphone every time you log in. And it's not just the phone number and the name, it's the birthday, every comment you put in there. Every time you log in, they send it to a US server. And they are allowed to do everything with the data. For example, Skype, which was said to be secure. They have in their contract, we are able to do legal interception. How if the encryption is secure? They can't, or the encryption isn't secure.
So I'm going to disagree a little bit. I think that we have to figure out how to trust somebody. And I completely agree that, that users have a right to know what's being done, and that we need to increase the transparency of privacy policies. As you were saying that, Jimmy, I was thinking that we've gotten to a point in our lives where we don't believe we should ever have to open a manual to use any service. We should never have to open a privacy policy. It should be evident based on the architecture of the service that this is what's happening, and it should be completely transparent. So I completely agree with that. I think there's going to be some market pressure that will get us there. I heard earlier today that 30% of the people in Holland stopped using WhatsApp when it was bought by Facebook. Obviously, most of the people that you spoke to stopped using WhatsApp, perhaps before it was bought by Facebook. So that's, I think that's a good market pressure. I think it should exist, and I think we shouldn't allow somebody to misuse that data and to continue to misuse that data and to retain the trust of users. So we should find better ways to service that data.
And Brad did mention this 30% less users on WhatsApp, but there's also a load of privacy protecting companies like one based in the Netherlands called EthicsInTech that people have been swarming to since the revelations. So I think there is movement to that. And on the terms of service issue in particular, I'm not sure if it's even possible for people to understand, or for us, anyone to understand, just how much can be gleaned about you, about your family, about your life, with all of the use of data that we're basically constantly emitting. There was a really interesting study conducted by Cambridge University about Facebook likes, just Facebook likes. And from an analysis of just those, they were able to determine with surprising accuracy a person's sexuality, their political standing, whether or not their parents had been divorced, whether or not they use or abuse drugs, all sorts of very, very, very personal and intimate aspects about your life, not just where you live and what your credit card number is, but who you are as an individual and who you associate with. And that was just from likes. So I think it's almost impossible to get to a point where individuals, no matter how simple the term of service might be, it will be very difficult for them to understand the risks, which makes it certainly a challenge for companies to express those risks. But this is certainly something that we should be moving towards.
So we have about 20 minutes left, so I want to...
I would like to say something. I think more or less we agree on many things.
Use the mic.
By design and good. You said that it was interesting to see those people who quitted 20% such a service. Would you like that we do the same thing with things we buy to eat? Suddenly quitting 20% people stop buying some tomato or so because they are not good? Or do you think that we should have rules that we have tomatoes that can be eaten with being safe? I think data protection is a value, is a fundamental value, and respect, trust, and everything, and we should not have to stop to go to such and such service. Those services should be, and it should be an obligation for them to make good services in the line of trust. What do you do with the... It is very easy to explain what data are done with. It's very easy. Except that in the US, nobody looked how to write that very easily for everybody to understand. And when you say that an enterprise is able to from like, and the like on Facebook, is able to say who you are, your family, your sex, your life, and so forth. In my view, and I'm sure within some more months or years, people are going to ask what kind of study can be done with all these big data. Can we make any kind of studies, any kind, without any protection for the individual if he doesn't want to participate to a study? You can imagine the kind of study can be done.
I'm sorry, but I do want to make sure that we get to people who want to ask questions. Gentleman in the pink shirt.
I have a question, or really concern with the market-based solutions to surveillance online and to predicting privacy online. Is I think that while, Josh mentioned Spider Oak and so the companies like Silent Circle, I think while that's a great thing that there are companies out there that are working to protect our rights online, I think the downside of that is you end up with an inversion of freedom isn't free. In other words, I see Spider Oak is free for 2 gigabytes, but then they charge you $10 a month. $10 a month may not be much for the people on the panel, but for many people in the world, $10 a month is a lot. And so you end up with this scale where, again, the more money you have, the more protection you have. And does that ultimately weaken, rights if we're saying human rights can be purchased on the open market versus what I think you were talking about in the big is, the human rights.
The answer is with the price of music. At the time, people were downloading music, which was not allowed. I say to everybody, if you could buy a tape recorder, a thing, at least, for $2 or $3, the people will pay. We know that people are agreed to pay. But if it is too much, no.
I'm saying you shouldn't have to buy
So to follow up on that,
At that moment, it's
it's a great, I want to just make sure that everyone knows that there was recently an op-ed either today or yesterday in the New York Times by Julia Angwin called "Is Privacy Becoming a Luxury Good?" which if you haven't read it, you absolutely should read it, describing the costs of the various services. She recently wrote a book whose name is escaping me, but someone should Google it. Dragnet Nation, yes, is the name of the book. And the thing of it is, so she goes through and buys these different things. And part of the reason Spider Oak has to charge as much as it does, they're certainly interested in having the largest, user base and most business success that they can. But right now, this is a niche product where the demand for it is limited to, a relative handful of people who are winding up to pay for the privacy-enhanced version of file sharing. And so, the price point that optimizes for them right now is above what it would be if it was something a lot of people wanted to buy. So it's a little bit of a catch-22 in that regard. But Brad, did you want to jump in?
Well, I'll just say that we're investors. I've been an investor for 20-some years now, and we really don't like to invest in those businesses, the privacy businesses, the businesses that where a consumer pays for a service which we agree should be free. And so that leaves us trying to understand how to invest in companies that do this exchange of data for service, and then how to morally invest in those companies with some conviction that they actually are either architecturally protecting that data along the lines of encrypting it from the browser going back in, or best case, somehow in the governance of the company itself, giving the consumers the voice and the access that allows you to feel comfortable that they're doing the right thing. Because if you just protect it architecturally, you end up in this problem of not being able to take advantage of services that you could otherwise offer, like search on the server side or collective intelligence of some way. So but I'm not yet ready to give up on the idea that it's possible to trust an entity. I won't even necessarily call it a corporation, but an entity that provides these services and provides them for free.
There are two questions, one here and one in the back corner, and I want to get to, and thirdly in the center here, and I'd like to try and get them all. Brad, I just want to, we'll start over here and work this way. I just want to follow quickly on the thing about investor interest in things direct with revenue to make sure that I understand what you're saying. Is that because the growth and adoption curve, if you're asking people to pay, is so much slower?
Yeah, you put your finger on it. It's a niche, and there isn't a demonstrated broad market. I'm sorry that there isn't in some ways, but that's the reason.
So let's start in the back corner here with.
Hi, Rahi Gazani. My question is this. I want to know the role of private security firms. McAfee, Trend Micro, RSA have been selling and marketing security products. So I noticed one of the panel members early on said that people don't care about their security, it's their responsibility to lock it down. People have been buying these security products for years and years and years, thinking that because they have a firewall, their data is safe. I'm curious, when you look at the RSA vulnerabilities that were put into the products, what would the European Parliament, for example, do for products that are not as advertised? I mean, what's about a case of false advertisement and sell a product that has no vulnerabilities in it? What is action the EU Parliament will take for the private
So it's
sector?
the equivalent of selling children's pajamas that go up in flames?
Exactly. And marketing it as a security product. So, any of the panel members want to talk about that?
Sorry. Well, I lost trust after having heard that RSA was paying. And I lost trust into those companies a lot. The only thing you can avoid, well, you can use security product software, encryption software, is it has to be open source. And it has to be reviewed. Use open source software, encrypt every data, don't trust no one. That's the conclusion of what happened in the last couple of months.
Can I, so I think since is it quarter of is the last? So let me kind of just, we have 10 minutes left. Let me get the questions onto the table from, I know the two, and if there are any others, and then I'll give everyone a chance to wrap up and respond collectively.
My name is Mike Malinik. I'm with Amnesty International. So this question, you'll get from that perspective. It's picking up on the previous point that was made up here about the monetarization of privacy. And the question is really about the dichotomy that was suggested by some of the panel between privacy and trust. To my mind, privacy is of course a right. And it's a right that's even to a certain extent recognized in this country if you send a letter or if you make a telephone call, but less so if you use the communication means we now all use. Trust is an emotion, and that's not, maybe it's an emotion that's useful to achieve a business end, to maximize profit or whatever the business objective is. But in any event, it seems to me that the comments made by the various panelists suggest that a market response solely is not going to safeguard the privacy rights. So then I guess my question is, surely we should be looking for something other than an emotional attachment to a company and a company's, I don't know, emotional or profit-based response as a way of addressing, of convincing people to trust. Surely there must be something more robust. And of course, the European approach does not seem, unintended consequences aside, does not seem to me to be a bad idea in terms of a way of ensuring that there are some basic ground rules to protect those privacy rights.
And then over.
And I'll be amazing with the insights. So there's a huge topic I feel we have to address collectively, not anything against it, which is context and sensitivity. If it becomes known to others that I prefer action movies, romantic comedies, the possibility for harm to me is negligible. If it becomes known to others that I search for information on sexually transmitted diseases, potential harm to me and to others, my associates, becomes significant. So within the context of pretty much everything that's been talked about today, where does context and sensitivity come up? So it's a huge, huge factor.
So let me sort of take, I think those questions, or is there one? Sorry, yeah.
So the thing is, data has value at scale. It creates a $40 billion company in Google, and to go more extreme, if all medical data were public, it would save a lot of lives. But that's medical data, and clearly that's going too far. So how do we balance that? Because I mean, you can't. It's almost too easy to say, all data is ours and should be ours alone, because that's just not how the economics work. It scales up very, very powerfully.
All right, so, okay, last one and then we'll back around.
Yeah, I'd like to ask about a different sort of public-private partnership, which is the likelihood that governments are just commercially buying data from data brokers and using that information. And I wonder if you can comment on that and whether or not that, thinking a little more as a conspiracy theorist here, might be cutting down on their tendency to regulate that industry.
So let me I'm going to try and synthesize those questions into something that's a single sort of thing. And to the extent, if people want to jump in on pieces of what was just asked, feel free. But I think one of the core things here is, as Brad was saying earlier, we need some social structure to control, and there's something that's analogous a little bit to some kind of environmental thing where, okay, I give my data to this company and that company, even the people in Holland who are no longer using WhatsApp have given each of them hundreds of copies of their evolving address book to a U.S. firm, and it's sitting on a U.S. server somewhere, perhaps not deleted and whatever else. So I think that one question is, given that we do live in a world where there's enormous value, as was just said, in big data and lots and lots of use of it, and given that it seems unlikely that we're going to wake up tomorrow in a world where pervasive use of big data has suddenly halted, I think that there's a real question about what are realistic controls or realistic possibilities. And one thing that gets tossed around a lot is controls on use. If there's going to be big, because a lot of the privacy conversation up till now has been about how can we limit collection, and that'll obviously continue for a lot of key areas. But I think one question is that I think comes up in the context of all of these questions that were just raised is, once data has already been gathered, how do we put ourselves in a place where we can still have a conversation about public policy that imposes some constraint on the way that potentially sensitive data is used, and that gives people some reason for some confidence or some trust that even after there may be companies that have a lot of data about them, nonetheless, they are still in some ways protected against some of these possible harms.
Well, okay, it's David staring at me. One of the things that I'll say on the outset that's really scary, when hearing some of the reactions and some of the thoughts, is this notion that elected officials and policymakers are best able to protect users, and the policies they put in place or the bills they create and pass are going to be what will do the most to secure our protections. And at least my experience in Washington is anything but that. And I'd certainly say, like, when you look at those scales of trust, I like Brad's notion of trust. I think that's why all of us come to him for advice on things, and he's right. But one of the organizations that we least trust here in the United States, and I think this extends to a lot of countries, is our government. So why would we want to then put a bunch of folks who don't realize that taking a naked picture of yourself and putting it on Instagram or was it Facebook is a bad idea, and ask them to create better privacy practices and what data can and shouldn't be shared and how companies should use it? I mean, that's immediately getting us into a world where we're going to find chilling effects left and right, and really quashing good innovation that could actually have the opportunity to both let us leverage data to do good, to save lives, to improve our lives, and at the same time, really find ourselves in a circumstance where we just kind of stop not innovating at all. The other thing I'd say, it's interesting in this discussion, so I'm no expert, no constitutional scholar, there are people in this room who are, but I keep seeing a lot of the same debates that we always have between freedom of speech and hate speech coming up time and time again. And I know that's a bit of a polarizing example, but in so much of how we think about, well, what's okay to share, what's not okay to share, what should we allow, what should we not allow, it readily lends itself to a world where it immediately evokes those debates. And the example I'll use that comes front of brain is a lack of understanding what the cultural contexts are for how we think about our online data and our online personalities. So in Argentina, for example, when you're looking at legislation primarily addressing copyright or takedowns on the internet, it's not about somebody believing their content is on there and being monetized inappropriately. It's because the society there is far more inclined to ensure that there is nothing said negative about you online. And so you'll find celebrities and others, and particularly politicians who don't like what their critics are saying, using copyright as an excuse to pull down unfavorable content. Certainly that's something we would normally talk about as privacy. I think in this case, though, we would, in this room, all agree that you should be allowed to say things about public officials that they might not love, and it should be able to exist on the internet. And I want to make sure we're really careful here.
So I want to just actually, since you brought up also sort of Brad's suggestion, I want to mix up the order and do a ping pong approach here. So I'll give it to Brad next, actually, to just wrap up. But also, I should say we're at our time. So there's each minute is borrowed at this point.
Okay, so real quickly, I want to start with the democracy advocates in the hostile regime and ask the question of whether or not you'd be better protected if you had a very sophisticated group of engineers working on your behalf and using a system that they managed for you, or whether you'd be better protected using a bunch of tools that you cobble together with a bunch of inconsistencies that you had to figure out yourself. The problem with using a company or a larger entity to do that is you have to trust that larger entity, and I think we have real issues in figuring out how to do that. There's one way that I'd like to think about, and it comes back to this medical data example. It turns out, weirdly, that DNA data, a big portion of it is identical in all of us, and so it's on the one hand uniquely identifiable, but at a very small level of abstraction, completely anonymous, because it's just a human. And so there's a lot of value in the aggregation of that anonymous data. The question is, can we find a way to separate an individual from their data? And can we do that in the context of multiple companies each pursuing a market opportunity, but regulated to prevent the kinds of environmental problems that I talked about in the future, earlier? That's what I'd like to see.
Well, as I stated earlier, and we all, I think, agree, we've lost trust into governments, we've lost trust into companies, and it's theirs to regain our trust. But we can do something for ourselves. Some say the internet is broken because governments are spying on us. Some say the internet is broken because companies are misusing the internet. I say let's reclaim the net, and it's the net of us all, and we can reclaim it. And if you want to know, maybe by coincidence, some of you are in Austin for South by Southwest Interactive Conference next week. I'll be talking on Monday about how to secure yourself on the internet and how to secure your mobile phone.
I first want to thank the person who brought up data brokers. They are really the silent partners in this surveillance landscape, but unfortunately we don't have much time to address them. I just wanted to touch a bit on the cultural differences and the cultural approaches. Being Canadian and based in Brussels, having supported the EU's data protection reform efforts, and you might see some of our papers there to give you a little bit more information about what this regulation actually is and what it would actually imply. And having such a baseline standard and understanding what it is, it's not that scary. But I know there is a cultural difference with regards to government regulation and government telling corporations what to do. But from the other side, think about it in terms of being in a country where data protection is recognized as a fundamental right, that your data should be protected by governments, by corporations, by anyone who collects your data, and being in a situation whereby there are mostly US companies or foreign companies that you are using at all times, that you have very little control over, you have very little access to remedy, and this is exactly the same thing that happened in the revelations with the government surveillance, is that there are, 99% of the world doesn't really have a way to seek remedy. So what can you do, and what are the steps? And there are certainly, as Josh pointed out, issues with letting governments decide on very technical and complex issues. And then you also have lobbying that comes into this mix, which becomes very complicated. But at the same time, setting a baseline standard, like this gentleman from Amnesty had suggested, really can set a good standard for what can become, what can happen, and innovation can be built on top of that. And I think that's referred to the contextual approach that this gentleman brought up over here, because the thing about the age of big data is that information can be collected about you and used for different purposes. And if it is stored for indefinite periods of time, you never really know what it will be used for, even though it was collected for a completely different reason. So I know we're out of time, so I will just stop
So
there.
Marie, last minute, last word?
I heard a question, what about the government buying personal data? I heard that from America for the last 20 years. People asking why those data are not covered by the Privacy Act. Okay? You agree? So, please, Americans, help yourself for the best of everyone. And you won't be able to separate individual and their data very easily, because it's our identity. So it cannot be sold as such on the long term. There is a right, this person said, it's a fundamental right, your identity, your dignity and everything. You cannot leave anyone doing what they want with, telling you prescriptively, you're going to have a cancer within 3 months. Oh, you said that you're homosexual. Of course, you did not know. Listen, are we going to have such a world? No, it's not possible. So I'm sure with all what happened that America is going to think a little bit and come with the others that think in another way, and it will be for the best of your services, with the respect. And I'm okay with the work. And I think in the Convention 108 in the Council of Europe, the International Chamber of Commerce comes, EISA come, people are very happy to come to listen to people with our other practices and share those. So I hope that you will look at the Council of Europe website. The modernization is on its way, completely open. There had been over 200 contributions of people.
We're going to have to end there. I'd ask you to join me in thanking our panelists.
So,
Hello? Can everyone hear me okay? Or is this microphone? Okay. So welcome everyone, thanks for coming. I'm Ron Dietrich. I'm Director of Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto. Thank you for coming to this panel. We've got an interesting group of people here. We're going to talk about some of the research that's been done and some of the concerns that people have about threats that exist on the internet, online, in the digital world, for human rights groups, for NGOs, and for journalists. Talk about some of the projects that are going on and activities that are happening, and leave a lot of room in this session for conversation with people in the audience, because obviously there are a lot of people with a lot to say here, and so we really want to have a good conversation. I was asked to begin the presentation by saying a few remarks about general trends in this area that I observe, and then talk a bit about the Citizen Lab, where we fit into all of this. And then we're going to go to Bill Marzak, who's a Citizen Lab Research Fellow and a PhD student at the University of Berkeley, he's one of the co-authors of a report that was just published literally about 20 minutes ago. So we finally got it up. And he can talk more about that report, but also the research that he's doing. which, by the way, often takes place in collaboration with Eva Gelpern at EFF, and many of you, of course, know Eva. She will talk about the approach that she is taking with EFF and what she sees as some of the most important issues to address in this space. And then we're going to turn over finally to Enrique, who is really the architect of this panel, who is the one man who put it all together, and he will talk about the work that he's been doing, both, I guess, at Human Rights Watch, but now at Benetech as well, and Marvis and so forth. So to begin, let me just say a few remarks about where I see things going in this space. I've been doing research for, I guess, close to 20 years now, believe it or not, on internet-related issues. And generally speaking, I think the trends, at least as I see them, are getting kind of worse, not better. I think one uncomfortable truth that we have to recognize is that in the wake of the Snowden revelations, regardless of what you think of Snowden himself and those revelations, to me it's clear that in the short term, the reaction to it, the consequences and the impact of it in many countries around the world is going to make things even worse yet. And that's something we need to kind of prepare ourselves for. What do I mean by that? Well, if you think about it from the perspective of a policymaker in power in just about any country in the world that's not allied with the United States, the first thing they're going to do is they're going to turn to their security chief and say, are we being spied on by the United States? And the security chief will turn around and say, well, I can answer that, but I need $20 million in my budget, and I need to purchase specialized equipment to be able to do this. And oh, by the way, these capabilities will also allow you to take care of that meddlesome opposition group, those human rights activists that are embarrassing us. On top of that, I think that the trend over the last couple of decades is clear that cybersecurity is moving higher and higher on just about every country's agenda. In many respects, this was inevitable. We kind of turned our lives inside out. There are, something like 15 billion devices connected to the internet, including everything from just our laptops to critical infrastructure. So inevitably, this would become a major security issue. But of course, what cybersecurity means varies widely from country to country. So for some countries, that may mean we want to keep the networks functioning and financial traffic moving without disruption. But for other countries, it may mean preventing criticism of the government in power, or arresting people for mobilizing around certain key events. And I think when you reflect on that, and you think that the vast majority of growth in the next 5 years is going to come from countries that are flawed democracies or have gone through democratic transitions recently and are reverting back to something else, say in the case would be Egypt, or authoritarian or autocratic regimes, this paints a pretty troublesome picture. On top of that, of course, is the fact that thankfully many organizations are quickly adopting these tools to do wonderful things. Everything from digital humanitarian projects to crowdsource election monitoring efforts and so on. However, my concern is that the adoption of new technologies is happening faster than habits and practices around security can take place. And if you look at a context like, say, sub-Saharan Africa, a region that we're increasingly concerned about, you see a dangerous or a potent combination there. Internet growth rates on the order of several thousand% per year, many failed states, zones of conflict, autocratic regimes, and then lots of well-meaning NGOs and human rights groups that are quickly adopting these technologies but don't have a lot of capacity to even think about, let alone deal with adequately security issues. Meanwhile, adding into the mix of all of this is what I lump together as the cybersecurity industrial complex. So after 9/11, of course, there was a great deal of concern focused on analyzing big data, essentially all of the emissions that we leave behind us as we go about our digital lives. This is a huge market. both on the consumer preference side, but also on the military intelligence law enforcement side. And in fact, many of the same companies service both market segments. So you have, for example, facial recognition companies that sell to Facebook or other companies like that, but also sell to the CIA or FBI. Many billions of dollars are feeding into this marketplace, which are putting into the hands of policymakers capabilities they never before imagined. Deep packet inspection, social media tracking, cell phone monitoring, advanced spyware, as we'll hear about later. And that market shows really no signs of abating. There have been some really important developments in this area. Legal cases launched by EFF, I think, are one important illustration of that. But generally speaking, the trend is that things are getting a lot worse rather than better in the short term. Turning from sort of high-level observations to where the Citizen Lab fits in all of this. Citizen Lab was founded in 2001, and we're not an NGO, we're not an advocacy group. I'm a professor of political science. The Citizen Lab is a research lab. But it's a research lab that's quite unique in terms of universities insofar as we don't fit with any disciplinary silo. So although I'm a political scientist, the people who work at the Citizen Lab are computer scientists, engineers, lawyers, sociologists, and so on. So we apply a mixed methods approach to all of the research that we do, broadly from a human rights perspective. Our aim is to produce as much evidence-based research that is reproducible in order to raise awareness about the issues that I just spoke about. To give one slice as an example of the type of research that we do, because we'll hear more about another element that Bill and his colleagues have really been leading up associated with the Citizen Lab. A different area is what we call the targeted threats research. And to give you some background, this goes back to at least 2007 when associates of the Citizen Lab got in touch with members of the Tibetan community, many of, well, at least one of whom is here right now, and her associates, and Nathan as well, where they suspected that their computers were being monitored, obviously by what they suspected to be the Chinese government. And for us, that was a new area of research. We were interested in working with them to try to analyze exactly what the nature of the threat is that they face. And the first iteration of that resulted in the GhostNet report, which was really an accidental discovery that the same attackers who had infiltrated Tibetans and their computers and had also infiltrated literally hundreds of government agencies, including ministries of foreign affairs and so on. I think it was the first cyber espionage report to produce that level of evidence in the public domain. I think it's still a landmark for that reason. After that report, we looked at the project from typically like a research perspective. We said, well, we started with maybe one or two groups, let's broaden it out. And for the last 3 years or so, we've been working not just with the Tibetans, but about a dozen non-governmental organizations who signed up to this study, have been sharing hundreds of emails with us on a regular basis. Through that, we've been able to get some insight into the nature of the threats that they face. We will be releasing a report that kind of summarizes the Targeted Threats Project in the next little while. The bottom line here is that when politicians and policymakers speak about cybersecurity, it's clear to me that there's a major gap here. So if you look at any speech by, say, President Obama on this topic, or any other world leader, when they talk about the need to address cybersecurity, they're talking primarily about government networks and big business in the financial sector and so on. Left entirely out of the equation is civil society. And this is the major problem I think we need to address when we talk on this panel, is that generally speaking, perhaps there are some exceptions, but from the research that we've done over the last 3 years, it's clear to us that NGOs, big, small, are, first of all, regularly targeted by increasingly sophisticated, in some cases commercial spyware, that is compromising the integrity of their networks and putting their operations at risk, including real human lives. And many of them have no capacity to deal with it. Their budgets don't give them enough resources to be able to, in some cases, even hire a network administrator, let alone someone who can go and actually investigate and deal with and remediate the problem. And while Citizen Lab has been doing this research, EFF, Privacy International, other groups likewise doing research and legal cases, and they've been picked up all over the world. We have a real problem right now, and that is there's no clear avenue of, for groups to go to be able to deal with the threats that they face. And I think there's especially an urgent case for donors to recognize and begin taking steps to remediate. I could go on at great length to put all of this, but I'd rather turn it over to my colleagues to talk about what they've been involved in to kind of take up some of that conversation. So, Bill, over to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Ryan. So, as Ron mentioned, I'm a research fellow in Citizen Lab, and about 20 minutes ago, we released the final chapter in our 3-part report on a company known as Hacking Team. Now, Hacking Team is an Italian company based in Milan, and what they do is they sell commercial surveillance spyware exclusively to governments. Now, this is software which the government attempts to install on your computer or mobile phone, and it gives them access to your files, to your Skype calls, and even allows them to turn on the microphone and webcam on the laptop or phone to spy on things happening in the vicinity of your devices. And the first kind of main part of our report looked at how this is used and regularly abused by governments to target civil society as well as activists and journalists. So the first part of our report focused on how the Ethiopian government apparently was using this spyware to target journalists based in the United States, reporting on Ethiopian issues. So specifically, there was this organization, ESAT, which is a satellite channel run by the diaspora. And these guys began receiving suspicious files via email and via Skype. And it turned out that these files were designed to install this sophisticated espionage software on their computers from the Hacking Team. So this is kind of an example of some of the research that we do at Citizen Lab, working with these groups who are likely to be targeted, analyzing these suspicious files, and tracing the spyware to, in some cases, these commercial vendors. One of the really cool things we've been able to do in this space, besides just identify the types of spyware, these types of commercial spyware, is also trace them to other governments around the world. So once we have one instance of one of these types of spyware, we are able to determine what we're looking for, and then we're able to do scanning and locate other countries that are also using this same type of spyware. So in the case of Hacking Team, we were actually able to trace this to 21 governments around the world, including very repressive places like Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, United Arab Emirates, Oman, Turkey, etc. There's a very interesting list of countries. These companies, like Hacking Team, and there's another one called Finfisher out of Germany, they claim that this is software designed for lawful intercept. In other words, designed to investigate serious crimes. For example, terrorism, drug trafficking, child pornography. But more often than not, we see continuous examples of this spyware being used to target journalists and activists. We saw it used against activists in Bahrain, and activists in the United Arab Emirates, and an American citizen critical of Turkish charter schools in the United States. There's more and more examples. So the latest part that we released is actually very interesting, which looks at how this spyware is designed to be hidden. In other words, if someone's infected or someone receives the spyware, it's designed to be untraceable back to the government which targeted them. And the way that this is often done is by the government has to communicate with infected computers and phones to receive the information. But often this information is bounced around the world to disguise its true destination, in other words, where it's actually going, which government is actually consuming it. And we uncovered that a large part of this network of bouncing traffic around the world actually exists here in the United States. Commercial hosting companies like Linode and Rackspace are running large numbers of servers. I think we found 80 servers being run by Linode that were designed to funnel data gathered by spyware back to governments such as Uzbekistan, Ethiopia, a number of other oppressive places, which raises some very interesting legal issues. But all in all, I guess the takeaways are this is very scary stuff. Commercial spyware is on the rise, and it's despite my best efforts of giving advice to journalists and activists, it's often the case that they either can't follow the advice. For example, I've been working with these Ethiopian journalists in DC for a while, and I advised them, you're being targeted by attachments. Don't open attachments that you receive. If you receive a Word document attachment, open it up in Google Docs, which is this great thing that you can do now if you have a Gmail account and you get a Word document as an attachment. You can actually open it and edit it without ever downloading it to your computer and putting yourself at risk. So I advised the Ethiopians to do this, but I later found out that they weren't doing this, and I asked them why. And they said, oh, well, we have to edit these Word documents, and we write in Amharic, the language of Ethiopia, and it is a special script which is not supported by Google Docs. And in fact, we have to install specialized software on our computers to edit these documents, which require downloading to a computer and opening it in Microsoft Word, thereby putting yourself at risk of infection. So I think in terms of steps to protect and defend journalists and activists, at least from these types of spyware attacks, it's important to understand, I think, what the landscape is like, why people are doing the things they're doing, and maybe very unexpected reasons, like I didn't anticipate about the Empire test. So anyway, very scary stuff, and I think there needs to be some good work done in terms of surveying, in terms of interviewing, in terms of testing, to understand why journalists, why activists, why NGOs and NGO workers make the decisions they do with regard to security, and where we as a community can help.
Thanks for that, Bill. One thing I was going to mention, just based on the remarks about attachments as a vector for malware distribution, in the targeted threats report that's yet to be released that we're preparing, one of the conclusions that we draw based on this 3 years of research and interviews with the groups that were involved in that project is that their harm could be reduced by something like 85% if they just stopped opening attachments. And in fact, the Tibetan communities have a campaign called Detach from Attachments that we should look at, and maybe we can talk about that later on in the discussion, or Nathan, because it's an interesting campaign, which points to the importance of just some basic awareness for users would be very valuable in this space, especially for journalists. And so I want to turn now to Eva to take over from here. Eva,
Hi there.
over to you.
Hi, I'm Eva Galburn. I work for the Electronic Frontier Foundation. You may have heard of this. We're a group of lawyers, activists, and technologists working together to make sure that when you go online, your rights come with you. And I guess if there is a sort of activist equivalent to an interdisciplinary organization, we are it. So I work on the international team, so primarily I spend most of my time thinking about the global internet and global threats, and particularly vulnerable populations such as activists and journalists. And to that end, I have spent the last, I would say, 2 or 3 years collaborating with researchers at Citizen Lab on a number of projects, including sort of a mapping of the malware space in Syria, a report on malware in Vietnam, which was particularly hilarious because they targeted me, thus making things so much easier for the collection of malware. And most recently, EFF has launched a legal case. We have sued the nation of Ethiopia over their spying on a former Ethiopian citizen, now US citizen, living in and around Washington, D.C. And they spied on him by covertly installing a copy of FinFisher on his computer. They managed to spy on a number of Google searches and also on some Skype calls, and we're not entirely sure what else. But because we are absolutely certain that this happened thanks to Bill's analysis, we are able to sue the nation of Ethiopia under the US Wiretapping Act, because it turns out that spying on people's phone calls without any kind of warrant or their consent is illegal in the United States. So this all started because we had been working on a lot of other malware projects. But usually when it comes to these projects, I am the middleman. So a Citizen Lab researcher came to me and said, so we have these photos, and these photos are being used in the targeting of malware, and we think they're of this Ethiopian group called Ginbot 7. Do you know anybody from Ginbot 7? And I said, well, no, but my job is to travel all over the world talking to activists. I'm pretty sure I can find out. And it turned out to be rather tricky, because Ginbot 7 has been named as a terrorist group by the government of Ethiopia, largely because they oppose the government of Ethiopia, which they find terrifying. And they are not known as they are not considered to be a terrorist group by any other country. And so they're extremely cautious about new people approaching them and saying, hey, I hear you have some sort of security problem, let me take a look at your network. So it took me about 3 months to find somebody from Ginbot 7 who was willing to talk to me and to spend enough time slowly talking to them about what we thought the problem might be and earning their trust to the point where they would let us take a look at their computers. Somewhere around the 3-month mark, Citizen Lab published their Ethiopia report, or rather their FinFisher report, which included a report of the command and control server that they had found in Ethiopian IP space, indicating that the government of Ethiopia had, in fact, purchased FinFisher. And I think that this was really instrumental to gaining the trust of the members of Ginbot 7. So what's particularly interesting about this lawsuit is that, well, not only that it has its roots in this long-time collaboration between Citizen Lab and EFF, but I think that this is really the next step. This is our first step on the offensive against international and warrantless surveillance. We have spent the last several years just trying to map the landscape, because it's not as if the companies that make these tools publish lists of their customers, and it's not as if the customers publish lists of places that they buy these tools from. And so the only way that we can really have some idea of who is selling what to whom, and therefore taking part or helping to enable human rights violations all over the world in places like Bahrain and Morocco and Vietnam, is essentially by reverse engineering it. Either by finding the command and control servers and sort of getting some idea of where these spyware tools are being sold to in that way, and also by simply talking to the activists, talking to the people in the community, and gaining enough of their trust that they're willing to send me their malware. So that we can analyze it and have some idea of what is being used to spy on them. And we've sort of combined our forces in order to get a very small and partial map of some of the world's surveillance landscape, which is more than we had before. But our first step on the offensive is suing the government of Ethiopia. And I think that this is particularly important, especially in light of EFF's long-standing cases against the NSA and its program of mass surveillance. EFF launched its first lawsuit against AT&T for its part in the NSA's mass surveillance in, I think it was 2006, meaning that the case is now old enough to go to grade school. And we launched our most recent case against the US government in a matter regarding the Verizon order, which was I think was the very first document that came out of the Snowden revelations, before we even knew who Edward Snowden was. And we launched that case, I think, last year. So we've been at this a long time. We're the old school litigants on this. But the world in which the real politic that the NSA says that it's playing is essentially people in the US are protected. The NSA is not supposed to spy on US persons on US soil. But when it comes to the rest of the world, the NSA insists that the rest of the world is fair game. And this is bad news for me, because I spend most of my time talking to non-US persons on non-US soil, and I'm not particularly enthused about the notion of telling them they're completely out of luck when it comes to protecting themselves against NSA spying, and that the only tools that they have to defend themselves are the technical tools with which I can help associate them with. They should have legal protections. The law still applies. International law still applies. But as far as the NSA is concerned, they can do whatever they can get away with. And a world in which intelligence agencies can do anything they can get away with and anybody out of the country is fair game is a world in which Ethiopia feels free to spy on a US person, on US soil, however the hell it wants, without getting any kind of warrant, without engaging in any kind of due process. And so if you are a US person, suddenly when you're talking about mass surveillance, you don't have to just worry about the NSA spying on you. Maybe you don't mind if the NSA reads your email. You figure, hey, I've got nothing to hide. But do you mind if China reads your email? Do you mind if Russia reads your email? Do you think that the GCHQ should be reading your email? Do you think Vietnam should be reading your email? Or Ethiopia? This is not just the big players that we think of as being particularly strong in the area of cybersecurity. Any country with, a couple $100,000s to give to a company like Finfisher or Hacking Team is now a player in this game, and we are not safe from any of them. And so I think that's the reason why EFF's legal cases are so vitally important, and that's also the reason why I'm so enthusiastic to see how they're going to play out.
Thanks so much, Eva. Enrique, over to you.
Okay. Hi. I get very anxious and I have to talk. Also, my accent is bigger, so you're going to have to bear with me. This kind of conversation in my accent should continue. So I'm Enrique Piraces. I work at Benetech. I lead the human rights program there. Benetech has been providing a free and open source information management and encryption technology for the global human rights movement for about 10 years. And I'm very excited about being at RightsCon 2014, and I'm particularly excited about being able to join a conversation with the Electronic Frontier Foundation and the Citizen Lab about a topic that I think is increasingly key for the advancement and defense of human rights. The Citizen Lab and the Electronic Frontier Foundation, among other organizations like Human Rights Watch and Privacy International, are paving the road toward a better understanding of the scope and implications of global surveillance. So for those in the audience that have the ability to support or contribute, I would like to ask you to make sure that you engage with them at the end of this presentation. This is definitely very important work. Let me tell you something. I think that one of the reasons the work is important, one of the reasons I'm excited about this panel, is because organizations like theirs, and Human Rights Watch and Privacy International, are going to become key for us to understand the implications of surveillance against those bits of civil society that are the most relevant. And that are the most relevant because they are struggling for accountability, transparency, and justice. People like activists, human rights defenders, and journalists. So again, I would really like to encourage you to support their work and contribute in any way you can. I'm going to switch to my second page.
So I'm here to, I guess this microphone. I'm here to briefly share with you some ideas around why this type of research is important and how it can help us better address the impact of surveillance on human rights defenders and journalists. So for many years, security experts, privacy advocates, and whistleblowers have been warning us about the growing capacity of surveillance that states have. They have also been warning about the risk of technology in the hands of the organized crime, and increasingly about the implications of companies and corporations being the brokers for our privacy and anonymity. So recent events like the revelations around Edward Snowden whistleblowing, the infiltration of the New York Times and other media outlets, the use of technology by the Mexican cartels, and the targeted attacks by governments in the global south against NGOs and dissidents beyond their borders have provided us with evidence of the scale and targeted nature of surveillance against human rights defenders and journalists. And in the context of human rights documentation and journalistic work, the effects of this increasingly technically advanced surveillance can be tremendous. And while I believe that there's much work to be done, like the groundbreaking research that you guys are doing, I think that we have enough evidence to say that for those that live and work in the last mile of the telecommunication networks and that have little understanding of the technical meaning and implications of surveillance and counter-surveillance, such effects can be catastrophic. And to add what my colleagues or co-panelists covered, I would say that to understand the effects on check surveillance, it's also important to consider other angles. Like the long-term implication that this has on the ability of many organizations to further support the human rights movement and the development of free media. And for example, human rights practitioners and defenders have largely relied on international cooperation for the adoption of technologies for the advancement of their causes. And the most recent revelations of large-scale surveillance programs by several governments, in many cases with the cooperation or support of the private sector, can undermine the credibility of many well-intended capacity building and technology transfer efforts that have long supported partners around the world. So, a better understanding of surveillance could inform threat modeling and risk assessment among developers and field implementers, as well as the design of capacity building and technology transfer strategies. In terms of field intervention, for example, I believe that a better understanding of this topic can help us convince the large and growing number of international organizations involved in the collection and storage of data from vulnerable populations to properly manage and secure what they collect, even in the absence of international legal standards and solely based on the do no harm principle. In terms of capacity building, what I have mentioned could not only inform curriculum design, but also allow us to strategically address those issues that the general public finally has put attention to. Stating what I hope is obvious for this community, methodologically sound research, as the Electronic Frontier Foundation and the Citizen Lab work shows, is key to shape the public debate and advocate for policy changes that respect, promote, and protect rights in the digital age. It also seems possible that in a day not too far from today, the use of malware, for example, could be documented with enough evidentiary weight to support transitional justice efforts in a place like Syria. And to channel some of the colleagues that were not able to be on the panel today, I think it's important to consider what governments and companies can do. This is the part where I'm really going to read. So support, I think that there's 3 or 4 things that governments and companies can do based on the research that you guys are doing. I think that it's important for governments and companies to support calls for greater regulations on the export of certain powerful surveillance tools at both the international and the national level. In particular, states who are part of the Wassenaar Arrangement on export controls for conventional arms and dual-use goods and technologies. That's the part that you have to do. Should not wait and start to implement the new controls as soon as possible. For those of us that were not aware of this before, in late 2013, new export controls were agreed in a number of areas, including surveillance and intelligence gathering. The second bit of this is that governments should ensure that there is adequate public debate over when various kinds of surveillance technologies should be used, under what authority, and what safeguards. And we as a civil society should be demanding greater insight into how governments are employing these tools in our name. in the last bit of this slide, is that for companies that market and sell surveillance tools, I hope there's not many of them here, there is growing recognition, politically and legally, that they do have a responsibility to prevent and address abuses linked to their business. Companies must take concrete steps to prevent abusive use of their products and services. And the EFF's Know Your Customer framework is a good starting point for how to implement this in practice. And finally, I would like to emphasize some of what I have said before. Further understanding the depth and prevalence of attacks against human rights defenders, citizen journalists, and media workers is key. And understanding the implications, impact, and harm of such attacks, as well as to actively debate the best path forward for the mitigation and prevention, both from a technical and a policy perspective, is something where I think this community can play a key role. At Benetech, we're looking to contribute our tiny grain of sand in that direction by supporting the measurement of the negative impact of technology on human rights defenders and journalists. As a result of discussions with partners, supporters, and techno activists, we believe we can do some with a framework for the collection, preservation, and sharing of information on the impact of technology on the safety and security of human rights defenders, with the goal of providing secure and privacy-aware access to systematized information in the public. So I want to thank you all for the opportunity to be here, and I look forward to learning about what type of things we can do together to advance the global human rights movement.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Enrique. I want to get into discussion from the audience already. There are people raising their hands, so I will be taking a cue, so just put up your hand if you want to get into it. I'll do the best I can. And maybe, if people don't mind, it's up to you introducing yourself when you speak. Is there a microphone in the room by chance that you could use? There's not?
We can use this one.
There's one here. It might require some sprinting around. Yes, back there.
Thank you so much. My name is Vahid Razavi with BizCloud and EthicsInTech. The question that I have for Citizen Lab and EFF is, where do you, today, the data that's being captured by the NSA resides not just at the NSA, it resides at its defense contractors like Booz Allen Hamilton that Snowden worked at back in during the Daniel Ellsberg's time. It resided at places like the RAND Corporation, Computer Science Corporation, a lot of the public companies that actually are doing the data collection. 80% of the NSA's budget is outsourced. So can you talk about where is the line and distinction between private companies' access to data as well as the public companies? Because Obama has announced that as part of his review of NSA, he's looking at giving the data to the private sector to hold on to. The data currently resides with the private sector. So maybe can you talk a little bit about what Obama's vision of this is, and how is this differentiated between the private sector and the government agencies in the future?
So I'm happy to take a crack and then we can go along. I think this is a very important topic for discussion. One of the points that was raised during Obama's presentation on the NSA that really disturbed me was how suddenly the whole conversation about metadata collection had been legitimized and normalized. So what went from being, hey, this is bad, the government is collecting all of our metadata, transformed in a subtle shift of, Obama's very eloquent in the speech to, yes, we have to collect it all, but the way we're going to do it is we're going to transfer it to a third party. And I thought at the time, well, who's it going to be, like Target or Walmart? It really disturbs me, this idea of like a big holding tank for all of the metadata. But security aside, more troubling was the fact that this had been normalized as part of the conversation. Generally speaking, I think when we speak about accountability and oversight, I believe that what we're doing collectively here at Citizen Lab, what EFF is doing, what Privacy International is doing, and many other groups in this space, is a form of distributed oversight, right? So in the age that we live in, we can't just build oversight mechanisms that rest within government structures, judges and so on. We need to expand it out. Why? Because the vast majority of the data that we're talking about is in the hands of the private sector. And we need many more points of oversight that come from civil society. I think the part of what we've been aiming to do, at least from the Citizen Lab's perspective, is to begin the process of legitimizing this type of research. So for those of you who are familiar with universities, it's not an easy thing to do that. So Bill comes from a PhD, he's doing his PhD in computer science. The type of research that Bill is doing, it's a pretty tough sell, or it traditionally has been, within the conservative departments there. And the training that computer scientists and engineers go through tends not to have this component to it. So in order for Bill to be able to do what he wants to do, it has to be made credible within the research communities. The same holds true for the political science. You know, when you go through political science, any social science, you have no technical training whatsoever. So in order to build up this distributed oversight capacity, beginning in the universities, we have to overcome disciplinary divides and make this type of research legitimate. I could talk much more about that, but I'd rather if somebody else wants to jump in.
Well, I just had one additional comment, which is that, by reframing the problem as a problem of where the government is storing the data rather than a problem of, mass warrantless collection of data, I feel that the Obama administration was engaged in an epic act of point missing. I would say even a deliberate act of point missing. There is absolutely no question that our lawsuit is based on mass collection, not that they're keeping it somewhere we don't like.
Sorry, I'll be better. Right back there. Here next.
See if we can all hear you.
Thank you. My name is Mariam Marsadegi, and we have an e-learning project for Iran human rights education called Talana. And my question is about the point that countries like Iran are not going to do bad things, particularly to people on U.S. soil, if the American government isn't engaged in those things. So NSA practices are not necessarily harmful, but they are very harmful when taken into the context of the message that it sends to governments of repressive regimes and what then they can do to us. My question is, do you think that those governments of Iran, of China, wouldn't be engaged in those acts if the United States wasn't? I think it's naive of us to think that if the United States holds itself back, then governments like of Iran are going to also hold themselves back.
I feel that this is a mischaracterization of my argument. I have said that a world in which people can spy however they can get away with spying with no real legal oversight internationally is essentially the world in which the NSA claims we live in. And I certainly think that Iran agrees with them. This is the very basis of realpolitik. What is particularly interesting about the EFF case against the nation of Ethiopia is that we are fighting against that. We're saying that if you are a country and you spy in the U.S. on a U.S. citizen without going through the proper legal channels, which honestly you can't because good luck getting a warrant, then you should face the legal consequences because the rule of law matters in the United States. That's why we have an entire floor of lawyers at EFF. If we did not believe in the rule of law, we would just be the technical floor. And believe me, it'd probably be a lot cheaper. So I think that this is actually just a very important first step to fighting back.
Okay, thank you, Eva. So back, over here. So it's the person down in the front first. Here. Thank you.
Here we go.
No. Actually, it's her right there.
Sorry.
My name is Rachel Beatsman. I came in 2011 as an activist, and now I work for the U.S. Department of Defense. So say what you will about that. One comment about people who question contractors being involved in having data is that the defense industrial base that has classified cleared contractors are regulated by the DISCOM, which they're in the process of revising. There are also a series of cyber readiness inspections being conducted about cyber threats to the DIB. So it's not a perfect process, but it's also, there are there are things there for people who may think it's a vacuum. My question is that there's a duplicity, which has been alluded to, which is that governments that criticize U.S. surveillance from one department turn around and then, ask the U.S., hey, can you have a copy of that tape, or, do you have that other, tap on someone else? And there are different legal authorities. There's counterintelligence, security, law enforcement. They all presumably have some realm of legitimate legal authority, right? Whether that's being abused or not. So if you could peel back the curtain, how can civil society work with governments? What would assure you that vulnerable populations are being protected, assuming that surveillance is never going to go away entirely? And then is there a double standard, which I think the previous question alluded to, where you're more comfortable with the U.S. or Great Britain doing something that becomes very scary when an authoritarian regime does it?
Can you hand the mic to the next person while Eva answers?
We can start with the rule of law. I think that would be nice. I think that our wiretapping case illustrates that we don't even need to write new laws. We can simply enforce the laws that are already on the books. There are already mechanisms by which, if the Ethiopian government had felt that our client was in fact breaking the law, could have petitioned the U.S. government for the right to tap his phone or possibly to tap his computer, but they did not do so. They chose to go around and covertly install Finfisher on his computer, and indeed to uninstall it shortly after the Ethiopia report came out. The only reason why we were able to get any forensic evidence about this spying was that something went wrong with the uninstall process, and it was not clean, and it left evidence behind, which is how we know that they spied on these spec calls. So I would settle for the rule of law and enforcing the laws that are already on the books. I'm not even necessarily calling for reform, though EFF has been extremely vocal in calling for reform of surveillance law, and specifically the Patriot Act and the FISA Amendments Act. But in this particular case, if we could just enforce the laws that we already have on the books, I think it'll be a great win.
I would like to that.
Four or 5 words. I mean, I think that beyond the structure of laws at the moment, I think that accountability and transparency are the two concepts that should permeate that. And the reality is that it's more an issue of leadership at the moment, that regulation. I mean, you have issues around Clapper, for example. It's unbelievable that certain people that have been caught in certain circumstances have not been made accountable. So that, I think accountability is something that needs to be enforced. There's the whole renditions experience, which is the John surveillance directly, but involves surveillance, and that shows how the U.S. government and other governments have been willing to share intelligence evidence with governments like the Libyan government. So I think that there should be, a leadership effort to, promote accountability and transparency and make, as you said, the rule to account for something.
Okay, so we have down there.
An administrative note, if I may.
Okay.
If you do not want to be recorded, you need to talk to the people that are doing the recording, like him and him. Otherwise, you'll be on record.
No,
one person.
Depends on which area you're talking about.
Hi, I'm Kavitha. I work with the Committee to Protect Journalists, and I love your idea about distributed oversight, and I just wondered if you have strategies for improving collaboration among organizations, and if we could be or should be sharing cases in a more systematic way.
So this is a great question, and of course it's often difficult for a variety of reasons that many people in the room are familiar with to get organizations to work together effectively. I mean, there are just basic issues about physical proximity and communications and so on. So it takes constant hard work, and within civil society generally, I think there is sometimes unavoidable competitiveness that goes on, where it's not surprising because there's scarce funds, everyone's competing for the same donors, and there's a temptation, I think, in the worst cases, to try to do everything, one organization to do everything. What I think works better, and if I had my ideal world, it would be where there are niches performed by different groups. And I think where you see the most positive outcomes are when, at least for us, when research that we have done is picked up and then pursued by partners who, say, launch a lawsuit. And the Ethiopian case is a prime example of that. There are other legal challenges going on that we're partnering with Privacy International about that are very similar. I think when it comes to organizations that work in areas like protecting journalists, there's a nice fitness that could happen where, the role is to raise awareness about threats to journalists, but also protect them. And in order to protect them, we need to find out what the threats are. And the threats require research that, can be done by NGOs. It's not mutually exclusive. That's not what we're talking about here. But there needs to be at least a place somewhere where the research skills and methodologies and techniques of investigation are refined. I happen to feel, this may sound self-serving, but it's true. I happen to feel that universities have a special role to play here when it comes to the subject matter we're talking about. The internet was born in the universities, and it's from the universities that the internet will wither or flourish. And I think, unfortunately, universities have kind of dropped out of the equation when it comes to standing up for threats to free expression and access to information that are happening worldwide. So universities have to recover that sense of stewardship, and that's kind of what we've been trying to do at the Citizen Lab, is use the basis, the platform of the university, to engage in impartial evidence-based research. For us, one last remark, so we've got a platform on that. It is a bit difficult because as a matter of principle, Citizen Lab doesn't take money from governments or companies directly. And that means there's a small pool from which we can draw, primarily research grants. I have to educate people about the fact that Citizen Lab, although a unit in the university, doesn't actually get money from the University of Toronto. That's not the way universities work. We actually pay rent through overhead, right? So the university taxes us, and it's all through research grants that we're able to exist.